The Battle of Kursk. (1943). Stalin and his general staff, having defeated General von Paulus's 6th Army at Stalingrad, launched their troops against the German positions in the southern Ukraine. The intention is to isolate them in the Caucasus in order to later destroy them with a large-scale envelopment. The exhausted Wehrmacht troops try to regroup in order to regain the initiative, but in the face of the Soviet push, opt for a withdrawal, moving to the bridgehead on the River Kuban. The Germans try to strengthen their positions in that area in order to stop the Soviet advance, which has been reinforced by landings in the Black Sea. At the start of February, the Red Army closes in on Rostov and occupies the city on the 14th of the same month following the German retreat. Field Marshal von Manstein, commanding the Army Group Don, attempts to halt the Soviet march, but is unsuccessful. From his headquarters at Zaporozhye, he orders the troops to regroup and counterattack the Red Army's weak points, those forces that have been fighting for some time without help. The brilliant military operation manages to stop the Soviet offensive, and on the 15th of March, the Soviet front at Voronezh is forced to retreat to the banks of the River Donets. With the coming of the thaw, and due to the mud, some of the fighting on the fronts is paralyzed. Von Manstein's victory helps to considerably improve German morale. However, the Red Army troops have penetrated the enemy vanguard, forming a salient more than 160 kilometers long and 200 wide, with the epicenter on the city of Kursk, between Orel in the north and Belgorod in the south, both in German hands. Meanwhile, on the River Kuban, the battles on land and in the air are vicious. Luftwaffe planes and the VVS, the Soviet Air Force, clash in more than 1,500 fights per day, with great losses on both sides. The Nazi leader wants the exhausted Wehrmacht soldiers to begin a new counter-offensive on the southeastern front, where they have suffered their worst defeat to date. The Führer is determined that the initiative should not remain in Soviet hands. Our soldiers are mentally prepared to attack, not for a war of attrition, he tells von Manstein, who favored holding defensive positions while the troops recover and the vehicle fleet is reorganized. After 2 years of war, the armies of the Third Reich have not been able to defeat Stalin's military machine And many Nazi high commanders think the only way of ending hostilities on the Eastern Front is to achieve an important victory over the Soviets that forces them to sue for peace. If this were to happen, they could recuperate a part of the army to reinforce their positions in the west, where they expect an invasion in the north of France. For his part, Stalin has taken advantage of the winter to reinforce the offensive capacity of his forces on various fronts, with a view to beginning the summer campaign to finish off Hitler's war machine. The views of both the High Command of the German Armed Forces, OKH, and that of the Army, OKW, coincide with those of the Stavka, the High Command of the Red Army, that the definitive battle in Eastern Europe will be fought in the salient that the Soviets have occupied to the north of Kharkov, which threatens the defensive positions of the Wehrmacht and its rear. The Führer, who can count on new weapons such as the Panther and powerful Tiger tanks, and new aircraft such as the revolutionary fighter Focke-Wulf 190A, is convinced that he has the necessary forces to deliver a heavy blow to the Soviets in that area. He names General Heinz Guderian, whom he had dismissed following the failure in Moscow, Inspector General of the Armored Troops, with the mission of rearming the panzer divisions and regrouping them with the bulk of the army equipped with the most potent modern weapons. Afterwards, the summer offensive is to begin. However, Guderian, considered one of the Reich's great strategists, supports von Manstein's arguments and advises the Führer that it would be better to fight a containing war during what remains of the year in order to better equip the troops and begin the great offensive in 1944 with greater guarantees of success. But the impatient Hitler needs a big victory in the east, which will enable him to demand support from Turkey, and with that increase the capacity of his forces in his obsessive struggle to annihilate the Soviets. In mid-March, he meets with the OKW to plan Operation Citadel, a combined attack by Army Group Center and Army Group South. They are to block the Soviet advance and recover the area that Stalin's troops had managed to occupy during the previous winter. If the plan is successful, it will inflict a heavy blow on what the Nazis call the Slavic hordes, weakening them considerably in terms of men and weapons. This would swing the balance back in favor of Germany, which would regain the initiative on the battlefield. Hitler, convinced that this great operation will enable him to gain time and complete his new armaments program, aimed at giving him final victory, distributes the plans among the commanders in whom he has the most confidence. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, a great tactician and author of the plan for the invasion of France, has at his disposal, among others, the 4th Panzer Army, posted in the area of Borisovka, and the Army Group Kempf, situated further to the east of Kharkov. To complete the pincer movement, Field Marshal von Kluge, in charge of Army Group Center, will assign General Walter Model's 9th, posted in the outskirts of Kramy, to attack the northern zone of the Soviet positions in the salient. Model decides that General Hans Zahn, with the 46th Panzer Corps, will carry out operations on the right flank, and General Harp of the 41st on the left. In the center, General Joachim Lemelson's 47th Panther Division will advance on Kursk to smash the Soviet defenses and link up with von Manstein's army. The pincers of both attacks should put an end to Rokokovsky's Central Front and Vatutin's Voronezh Front. In this way, the Führer intends to regain the initiative lost at Stalingrad. Although its number of men has been reduced after 4 years of war, the Third Reich can still count on 10 million soldiers in more than 200 divisions. Operation Citadel will be assigned 6 infantry battalions, each with 15,000 men, which are being prepared and fully equipped. Hitler and his commanders have great confidence in the capacity of the Panzerdivisionen, and among these, especially the 3 Waffen-SS Grenadiers, and the elite units called Gross Deutschland. On April the 15th, Hitler gives the order to prepare Operation Citadel and warns, its success is fundamental. The quick victory in Kursk will light up the world. The Nazi leader hopes to straighten out the battle line and then begin the offensive against the troops of the Soviet Southwestern Front. "70 divisions, 28 of them armored and mechanized, together with more than 2,000 planes, will take part in the great battle that will give back to the Germans their fighting spirit on Russian soil." But Stalin and his high command, Stakva, have managed to put in place an excellent information service. Among many spies is a German called Rudolf Rossler, known as Lucy, who has very useful contacts among anti-Nazi groups in the Wehrmacht. Rossler, who has managed to discover the Germans' planes, passes the information to Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who sends the communist dictator a memorandum outlining the German movements and regrouping. Zhukov, recognized as one of the regime's greatest strategists following his victories over the Germans in Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad, will coordinate and supervise all the Soviet actions. The field marshal does not agree with Stalin's idea of attacking first. On this occasion, he prefers to let the enemy attack first and await developments. Stalin, won over by the defensive plan, gives him control of the army. Zhukov discusses his tactics of waiting for the German attack to run out of steam before going over to the offensive with Generals Konstantin Rokossovsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Central Front, Ivan Konev, Commander of the Steppe Military District and the Red Army Reserve, and Nikolai Vatutin, in charge of the Voronezh Front, who also participated in the Battle of Stalingrad. At the same time, they analyze the objectives of the Germans' Operation Citadel. They intend to use the advantage they have to destroy the main nucleus of the panzer divisions. Rokokovsky, Vatutin, Konev, and Malinovsky, in charge of the Southern Front, coordinate their efforts to transfer thousands of soldiers to the Kursk salient to reinforce the many rings that make up the Soviet defensive system. More than 250 kilometers deep and reaching to the reserve front of the steppe and the River Don, the Russian fortifications are formed by 8 successive lines of trenches called pack fronts, anti-tank fronts, along thousands of square miles. Situated in continual circles, supporting each other, each pack front is equipped with anti-tank guns, machine guns, mortars, and Katyushka rocket launchers. In total, the Soviets put in place more than 20,000 pieces of artillery, 1,000 rocket batteries, and 500,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, which the spring and summer flowers will hide. The Soviet commanders know that this battle could change the course of the war, and for this reason they have also doubled anti-aircraft defenses and increased the number of their planes concentrated in the Kursk Bulge. Stalin's enormous army is composed of more than 16 million men, and its equipment has been increased with British and American aid. And it's also equipped with the new T-34 and KV-1 tanks. Its components and leadership are vastly superior to the outdated army that Hitler faced in 1941. The Germans have available in the Kursk area a total of 900,000 men, 10,500 big guns, 2,700 tanks, and 2,000 planes. The Soviets have concentrated 1,300,000 men, 20,000 artillery pieces, 3,000 tanks, and 2,400 planes. The leaders of both sides are convinced that they will gain the victory. Hitler, who has delayed the offensive twice to wait for new arms such as the Panzer V, known as the Panther, and Panzer VI Tiger, and the Elephant gun, is confident that the confrontation will end with a rapid and decisive victory. For his part, Georgy Zhukov has told Stalin that he will destroy the most emblematic German panzer divisions and launch a counteroffensive that will force the enemy back to the river Dnieper. At the start of July, the Führer meets with the OKW in Ravensburg and tells them that the Operation Citadel will begin between the 4th and the 5th of that month. The German command is aware that the Soviets have discovered the enormous buildup around their positions in the Kursk salient, and therefore the advantage of surprise has been lost. What is more, the postponements of the operation have given Stalin the opportunity to plan his strategy of defense and counterattack. Nevertheless, the Führer shows his disregard for the advice of the professionals and orders the sappers to begin to disarm the minefields immediately. On the night of the 3rd of June, 2,700 explosives are disarmed by specialists, opening up corridors for the soldiers and vehicles. Pulling back, one of the sappers is picked up by a Soviet patrol on the Central Front and confesses that the hour the offensive is set to begin is 3 o'clock in the morning of the 5th. Rokossovsky and Vatutin place their fronts on maximum alert. For some days, the Soviet Air Force and the Luftwaffe have engaged in air fights to try to prevent the bombing aimed at destroying the infrastructure on both sides of the bulge. On the 4th, in the north, the 4th Panzer Army advances on the Soviet positions around Savidovka, while in the south, in torrential rain, specialized corps take on the first Red Army defensive posts. On the 5th of July, General Rokossovsky begins his artillery barrage before the Germans, while Soviet planes en masse attack Luftwaffe bases with the aim of eliminating them in the first hours of the battle. Alerted by new radar equipment, German fighters take off and engage the Soviet planes in one of the biggest air battles of the war. The surprised troops of the Reich respond with all their offensive capacity, advancing on the Soviet positions along a 30-kilometer front. The shock between the two forces results in a devastating struggle. The Wehrmacht units find themselves facing an intense barrage from the whole range of Red Army weaponry. The soldiers fight hand to hand, and the advance is slow and very costly in casualties. With great difficulties, the German sappers open paths through the minefields, and the armored divisions head for Bobrich and Nilitz. By mid-afternoon, Hitler's troops reach the road linking Kursk and Orel and continue their incursion using the tactic known as Panzerkiel, based on the few heavy Tigers which lead the advance, followed by Panthers and Panzers. In this way, they managed to destroy a part of the Soviet T-34 force placed in the front line. By the end of the day, the Germans have penetrated the Soviet lines and established a barrier from the outskirts of Nilitz to Ponyri. But on the eastern flank of the offensive, they are halted by the Soviets, despite the presence of the greatly feared Ferdinand tanks and Goliath bulldozers. The Germans begin to realize the strength of Zhukov's defensive system, which continues to receive reinforcements. In the south, on the Voronezh front, General Vatutin also anticipated the German offensive. Meanwhile, more than 500 planes engage in mortal combat in Soviet airspace, in which the Red Air Force suffers the most losses. At the same time, the Army Group Kempf continues its offensive through the corridor between Belgorod and Belovskaya, advancing with more than 700 panzers of the Third Army in the direction of Savidovka, Alexeyevka, and Rahavets, through the minefields that the sappers have tried to make passable. The 4th Armored Division head for Yakovlevo, and the SS Corps begin their attack in the direction of Pokrova and Sitrevo. Soviet resistance is ferocious, and in some areas assault troops are used to eliminate the entrenched enemy with flamethrowers. In Butova and its outskirts, Luftwaffe planes carry out heavy bombing, but torrential rain forces them back to their bases, and some of the new Panthers of the Decker Brigade get stuck in the minefields. By the 6th of June, the German advance has established positions in the north in a line that extends from the outskirts of Ponyri to Nilitz. General Rokossovsky, on the Soviet Central Front, is able to significantly increase the number of reinforcements in expectation of a new enemy attack. The infantry and tank corps fortify the areas of Malo-Arkhangelsk, Ponyri, and the north of the city of Olkhovatka. In the south, the breakthrough has taken a horseshoe shape, and the limits of the battle stretch from the city of Belovskaya, crossing the river Donets, to the vicinity of Petrovka and Sitrevo. Zhukov follows events with continual reports from the Soviet intelligence service. He knows that the Germans, following the first attack, are regrouping on the two fronts, and he decides to size up the situation of the Wehrmacht troops in the north, ordering a heavy bombardment and a counterattack with 100 tanks. The German response is not long in coming, and the panzer divisions halt the Soviet attack, while the Luftwaffe and the artillery begin the largest bombardment to date. In the south, General Vatutin receives the news that the SS and 48th Panzer Corps are massing to begin the attack against the Red Army positions. He requests help from Zhukov, who orders General Ivan Konev to transfer some of his reserves of men and vehicles to support Vatutin. In the early hours of the morning, the Germans launched their expected offensive with the armored forces and support from the Luftwaffe. They managed to break through the Soviet line and reach the road linking Belgorod and Kursk, entering the city of Luki in the afternoon. By nightfall, the SS panzers reached the Soviet second defensive line. On the right flank, Army Group Kempf is forced to halt its march to avoid getting ahead of schedule. To the north of the salient, Hitler's troops managed to recover 15 kilometers of lost territory. On the 7th of July, Model attacks again with 300 tanks against the Soviet T-34s. The fighting is hand-to-hand, and they are only able to advance 2 kilometers. On the 8th, he tries again with greater forces, but his efforts are to no avail. The Soviet planes, artillery, armored vehicles, and soldiers present an unsurmountable barrier which inflicts serious losses on the forces of the Third Reich. In the south, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps continues its advance to Prokhorovka with the fearsome Totenkopf in the lead. While its eastern flank destroys any Red Army resistance, the western, due to the push by the Soviet 7th Army, halts after crossing the River Donets. A hard-fought battle with armored vehicles takes place on the 9th in the vicinity of Ponyri and the hills of Olkhovatka. General Model is convinced they are the weak point of the Soviet defenses, and they can be overcome easily in order to march on Kursk. The German tanks advance in wedge formation, with the fearsome Tigers with their 88mm guns in the front attacking as a shield, and on both sides, the panzer groups. Along a 10-kilometer front between Ponyri and Soborovka, the vehicles escorted by thousands of soldiers advance towards the Soviet pack front, full of anti-tank guns and supported by T-34s. The deafening shock when the two sides meet becomes a hellish scene of fire and death, which forces the Germans to apply the brakes to their advance due to significant losses of Tigers. On the 10th of July, the 3rd Totenkopf Division comes up against the Soviet infantry and establishes a bridgehead on the River Sel, which they cross at nightfall in order to take up positions to attack the city of Prokhorovka. Meanwhile, the Army Group Kempf has resumed its march parallel to the River Donets in the direction of Rehavitz. All the Wehrmacht forces are deployed in the different lines of battle. Stavka knows that if the city of Prokhorovka falls into German hands in the south, the whole front could be blocked, and therefore sends reinforcements to the 5th Army to hold off the enemy. The Germans launch a diversionary attack with 5 infantry and 8 panzer divisions from von Manstein's army group. They hope to divert the Soviets' attention in order for the SS armored units to move northwards and Army Group Kempf to launch an offensive in the direction of Korocha. On the 11th, they managed to overcome the first defensive belt, but in the second, the Soviets stopped their advance. Forced to halt, the Germans send forces to support those in the vicinity of Prokhorovka, trying to reach Kursk from the southeast. In the north, Model continues his attack on Ponyri and the heights of Okhorovka, exhausting the capacity of his last divisions. Zhukov and Stavka are convinced that Germans have already carried out all the tactical moves they can, and their room for maneuver does not allow them to obtain more reinforcements. The Soviet High Command has very carefully prepared the counteroffensive. In the northern sector, it will be carried out by, on the Western Front, General Sokolovsky and his men with the objective of putting pressure on the Germans to the south and forcing them to retreat in the direction of Boljov and Kotinets in the order to surround them in the area of Orel. In the center, the forces of General Rokossovsky will carry out their attack in the direction of Kromy. On the Bryansk front, General Popov is to strike in the Novosil area in order to support Sokolovsky's troops and carry out a pincer movement on the Germans in Orel. To the south of Kursk, on the Voronezh front, Batutin and his army will counterattack towards Boromnia and Grasivoron, at the same time that, with the help of General Koniev's army, it confronts Army Group Kempf in its march to Kharkov. The forces on the southwest front, under General Malinovsky, will reinforce the attacks on Kharkov. The best Waffen-SS armored units attempt to penetrate deeper into Soviet-held territory, to the southeast through the vicinity of Prokhorovka. In the morning of July the 12th, the Soviet command launches the counteroffensive against the Reich forces with all its land and air potential. In the fields of Prokhorovka, the largest tank battle in history takes place. The SS 2nd Panzer Corps, composed of Das Reich Division, commanded by General Walter Kruger, takes up position on the right of the battle line, with the 3rd Totenkopf under Hermann Priess on the left. In the center is the 1st Adolf Hitler, commanded by Theodor Wysch. A total of 600 tanks and thousands of men make up the German attack force, which intends to smash through the Soviet defenses. In the early hours of the morning, the Red Army artillery opens fire on the Germans, accompanied by Katyushka rockets. Then, 900 tanks from the 5th Army, mostly T-34s and T-70s, under Pavel Ratsimusrov, advanced rapidly on the German armored corps to cancel the advantage of the superior firing range of the Panthers and Tigers as soon as possible. At 9 o'clock, a life and death struggle begins between 1,500 tanks. While the enormous German vehicles remain static, the Soviet T-34s come at them from an angle, trying to target the weakest points on the sides of the enemy tanks. At midday, the battle is still going on. In the air, the fights between Stutkas and Sturmovik planes are ferocious, while on land, men fight hand to hand and tank to tank. By dusk, General Rotmistrov has failed in his objective of annihilating the 2nd Panzer Corps and orders a withdrawal. The fighting in the Battle of Prokhorovka continues until the 16th of July, but neither side is able to gain victory, and the battlefield becomes an immense cemetery of men and machines. "350 German tanks, including many Tigers, have been destroyed, and more than 12,000 men have lost their lives." Manstein, Haupt, and Hauser are forced to detain the attack in the direction of Kursk through Prokhorovka. The Allied landings in Silesia and the Soviet offensive on all fronts forced the Germans onto the defensive. On the 23rd, following the disaster at Prokhorovka, von Kluge and von Manstein are summoned by Hitler to his headquarters in Rostenburg in Prussia. The face of the Führer reflects his anxiety about the failure of Operation Citadel and the situation in Italy. Von Kluge warns that the Soviet counteroffensive is unstoppable and proposes the Reich armies withdraw to a stronger line where they can recuperate. Von Manstein favors continuing Operation Citadel, convinced that one final push will achieve victory. But following the Soviets' Operation Kutuzov and the loss of Orel, he changes his mind. The forces of the Wehrmacht are exhausted and unable to hold off the Soviet attacks, and the OKW fears another Stalingrad. On the 29th, Stalin's troops occupy Boljov and march on Belgorod and Kharkov in an attempt to destroy the 4th Panzer Division and Army Group Kempf. The Germans have got more than 300,000 men in this area, along with 600 tanks and thousands of big guns and planes. On the 3rd of August, Kharkov Panzer divisions. But on the 13th of August, the 5th Army and soldiers of the Steppe Front break through the German lines around Kharkov and annihilate some of their troops, while the remainder begin the withdrawal. On the 23rd of August, the Soviets occupy the city. In the 37 days of the counteroffensive, the Red Army has been able to advance 150 kilometers to the west and destroy 15 divisions of the Wehrmacht. Hitler dismisses General Paul Hauser of the SS Panzer Corps. His invincible forces are faced by an impossible situation, thanks to the attacks by Stalin's army. The defeat has been overwhelming. The Soviets have achieved a notable and decisive victory, but have lost 800,000 men, more than 1,400 tanks, and 1,000 planes. The Third Reich has lost 300,000 men, 1,500 tanks, and 900 planes. Operation Citadel and the battles of Orel and Kharkov have been a failure for Hitler's strategy and have used up almost all his reserves of tanks. Kursk has been another lethal injection for the Nazi regime and a stimulus for the Soviets to step up their march on Berlin.